Hello everyone and welcome to this panel discussion. I'm Emily Gray, Executive Director of Mercury Musical Developments, and I'm here running this panel discussion and chairing it with James Hadley of Musical Theatre Network. It's great to welcome our audience and welcome our fabulous panel. At this very discombobulating time, we felt it was really important to gather people together who are at the heart of venues and are struggling with all sorts of things and looking forward in a myriad of ways to work out how we all as a sector are going to move forwards. So I hope you enjoy this discussion. We'll be meeting our panel members and asking them questions, and then in the last half an hour of our chat we will open up to questions from the audience. But for now, over to James. Thank you.
Yeah, welcome and thanks for joining us. I'm James from Musical Theatre Network, and as Emily said, we'll soon be asking our panelists to introduce themselves, and then Emily and I will lead about a half hour of discussion, and then we're over to answering questions from all of you tuning in if you're watching this live. If you have a question that you think of at any time during the discussion, please put it into the live chat feed in YouTube. Prefaced with the word question in capital letters, and that way we'll make sure we catch it and put it to our panelists. We will be looking at those questions in the last third of the discussion, so don't be alarmed if you do think of a question. Do put it into the chat feed as soon as you think of it, and we will address it in the later part of the discussion. And yeah, sit back and enjoy. Thank you for joining us. So without further ado, we're going to get our panelists to introduce themselves, starting with Chris.
Hi everyone, I'm Chris Sudworth, Director of Artistic Programme at Birmingham Hippodrome. My role leads on the programming of our main house and studio. I oversee the learning, participation and artist development work as well, and any productions or co-productions that we're part of. Prior to my time at the Hippodrome, I was a small and medium scale director and producer, and the first director of the new venue in Northamptonshire a few years ago, the Core at Corby Cube. The Hippodrome, as some of you will know, but not everyone, for decades has been seen as one of the premier receiving venues in the UK. And in the last 2 years, certainly, but over the last few years, under the leadership of Fiona Allen, who is president of UK Theatre, we've become more of a significant creator and co-producer of work for our stages, but also for our streets. And that includes large-scale festivals, associate companies, and most notably, recently, our What's on Stage award-winning UK Theatre nominated production of The Colour Purple, which we're really proud of, that we made with Curve Leicester, and a fully produced main stage version of West Side Story with a young cast last summer as well. Both of those were part of our 120th birthday celebrations. On top of that, we've got a really strong schools network that we're in every week of the year. Brilliant young company training pathways, including a musicals program that we lead with Perfect Pitch. And I guess just a little bit about our spaces. We've got a 1,850 seat main house, but less people know we've got a lovely studio, which is a 210 seat Patrick studio. And it is very much a mid-scale stage in a small-scale venue, if you like. So it's a really great space for movement-led work, but also for the development of new musicals, which is an area we've begun to operate in much more recently. And I guess it's really just flagging that while the impact of COVID-19 is incredibly difficult right now, it doesn't take us away from those ambitions to make work that's much more representative of our city and the country that we live in, and to really collaborate on pathways to develop the talent that can make that a reality.
Thanks so much, Chris. And over to Suzanne.
Hi everyone, my name is Suzanne McLean. I am the CEO and Artistic Director of Theatre Peckham. Theatre Peckham is a 200-seat venue in the heart of Southwark. It's on the borderline between Camberwell and Peckham. We have a gorgeous 200-seat theatre, and we have 2 studio spaces, and beautiful, wonderful foyer that can that houses our gallery space as well. Theatre Peckham has been in existence for over 30 years, and there's a lot of development of young people and of new and emerging talent. It's also a very strong place for a voice for its local community. I think theatre for us at Theatre Peckham is really about igniting imaginations and inspiring creativity. So we do this through classes, through online platforms, youth forums, performances, and other opportunities. And a key part of our work is about introducing new stories to new audiences and really building up theatre for people who traditionally wouldn't think of theatre as a place to go. We, in terms of musicals, a lot of the musicals that are put on traditionally at Theatre Peckham are brand new, newly written pieces. And in terms of the theatre that's on at the theatre, in terms of drama and dance, all of that is about new work. So we're really championing new voices and giving them a platform on our stage. In terms of thinking about life since COVID, we very quickly transformed all of our programs onto online so that we could keep our young people engaged. That was our most important aspect of our work. Usually we have over 400 young people coming in over the evenings and at weekends. So we wanted to make sure that we could still keep them engaged and keep them creative. And in terms of the future of life at Theatre Peckham, that's what a lot of the work is now, of thinking about how we can start to think about coming back into the space, making it safe, and how that programme can evolve in a new light. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne. And now Joe and Will.
Hello, everyone. We are Joe and Will from Hope Mill Theatre in Manchester. We are both co-founders of the space, which we opened almost 5 years ago in 2015. I take the role of executive director and Joe artistic director. The space is 120 seats. It's actually situated in the Grade 2 listed former cotton mill, so it's got lots of historical Manchester charm, and then it's a multi-purpose sort of space, and you can play it all different ways. I lead in the programming side of things. So since we opened in late 2015, we've primarily started in-house producing musicals. To date, we've produced and collaborated on 13 musicals and 2 plays, as well as being an in-house producing venue. We are also a receiving venue, mainly for Manchester theatre companies, region-based theatre companies and small touring work. We are programmed usually all year round with work, with it being about 50-50 with in-house produced and received work as well. We made the decision as an organisation to transition into a charitable organisation in November 2019, really to secure the future of the venue, as well as opening us up more to our community, because we were becoming a real integral part of the Manchester theatre scene, and it's something we wanted Hope Mill to be there for a long time and do a lot more work within the area that we're situated in, North Manchester. And that we continue to look at ways of offering platforms for new writing. So through our Powerhouse project development, which is started off 3 years ago for new writing, mainly developing plays. But last year we started developing musicals through that as well. And it's an opportunity for us to give writers or companies a platform to perform in under the umbrella of Powerhouse projects. We had this was going to be Hope Mill Theatre's first year sole producing.
on its own. We had been collaborating up until this point. And of course, we had 3 in-house productions that we were producing, which we, when COVID obviously happened and we closed down the venue, we cancelled firstly. And then with all of our received work, we reprogrammed to next year. Our current situation is that obviously we remain closed, but what we have done is we've taken our production of Rent, the musical, which was supposed to be starting at the end of this month, and we've moved it to the end of October, hoping that there might be a world that might happen. We don't know in what capacity, we don't know obviously what restrictions will be in place, but it's something that we're monitoring every day, and we hope that we will be able to be back later this year. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Joe and Will. And then over to Joanne.
Hi, I'm Jo Benjamin. I'm currently Executive General Manager at Trafalgar Entertainment. We do produce and co-produce musicals, everything from King and I, which I've been working on for the last 3 years, which has been in the West End and on tour, to very small musicals which happen in the studio at Trafalgar Studios, which the company own. We have the company's grown since its inception 3 years ago, and we have 4 or 5 musicals on the slate to do in the next 2 or 3 years, depending on what happens. Some of them are new, some of them are revivals, and the company, over its last 3 years, Howard produced with Bristol Vic, The Grinning Man, which was in Trafalgar Studios. We've done a number of very small musicals in the studio at Trafalgar, and we're looking at some bigger musicals. We're also looking at the possibility of developing new work. The company now owns 2 venues, Trafalgar Studios, which is currently in this COVID lapse, being redeveloped back from 2 small theatres into a 600-seat theatre, which hopefully will enable us to do more musical theatre work in there. And they've just bought the Theatre Royal in Sydney, so looking at shows to go over abroad. I think it's for discussion, but certainly we have discussed the possibility of using Trafalgar during the day for some development work for studios, and I do believe that MMD have talked to other people at Trafalgar about that, but we're very keen to help new writers and to allow people the sort of possibility of developing their work. It's programming wise, we have a mixture of plays, musicals, sort of we'll look at whatever's available and see what fits into our schedule. We're always interested in collaborations, and I mean, in the current time, we've obviously, all the shows that we had closed down very dramatically in March. Most of the company are on furlough, apart from a couple of us, but we are working very hard on 6 or 7 projects, which we're hoping to get up as soon as we're allowed to, or somebody gives us some slightly more clear definition of what we can and can't do. But I have spent an awful lot of time in the last 2 weeks looking at government guidelines, which is getting stressful and boring, but hopefully it will bring us some clarity eventually. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. And over to Yaman.
Thanks, James. Yeah, hello, everybody. My name is Yaman Chaudhry. I am the Joint Chief Executive and Artistic Director at Hackney Empire. The Hackney Empire is a 119-year-old theatre in the heart of Hackney in London's East End. It is a 1,200-seat receiving and producing house. I would say during my tenure, our main remit is trying to diversify what audiences, creatives, and storytellers look like in the sector, in what we feel can resemble somewhat of a homogenous monoculture in many respects. We really want to push the barriers and the envelope on that. Particularly proud of our work with young people and community. So we currently work with just over 4,500 young people every single year in a creative learning and participation and development program that runs for about 48 weeks of the year. And we've worked with people like Suzanne and Theatre Peckham. Yeah, as Suzanne said, all of that work has now moved online. In terms of where Hackney Empire is at the minute, it's crisis mode, as it is for many of my peers on this call and many people across the sector. Really, as Joe was saying, Joe, who actually is one of my teachers in producing, she might not want that credit, but she's going to get it regardless. Yeah, it's really just taking it day by day, trying to figure out what the next best steps are, not taking any steps too quickly. As many people will be aware, there was new announcement made last week, at the end of last week, regarding theatres reopening. And so things like that, just trying to tread lightly and really see what is sensible and use our foresight to try to be strategic at a time where nobody really knows what the next steps are.
Great. Oh, thank you all so much. It's really interesting to have a really good range of sort of sizes of space and slightly different types of work, but it's lovely that you all are passionate about new work and musical theatre. So this is really tricky, isn't it? This sense of going, we have to take things day by day as new announcements are coming out, new guidelines. We're all trying to get our heads around them. But does anybody have a sense of an expectation, or does anyone feel they have an idea when you could start programming again or open your doors again, or the sort of timelines you might be working to? Obviously with the caveat of saying things may change. But I think it would just be so interesting for us to hear if there are plans afoot. If anyone's...
Yeah, I mean, I'm okay to kick off. I guess there's kind of the official lines of what we know, and then there's probably the most optimistic elements, and then what feels realistic or most likely, and some of it is dependent on the venues and the government's guidelines, and some of it is I think, you know, increasingly the further up the scale you go, dependent on the availability of shows and the time it takes to create those shows, and the risk that investors are willing to put in to get those shows back off the ground and to get people back in a room. So I think all of those factors come together in our case. So we currently have announced that we're closed until the 2nd of November. So that's still the official line of where we are at the moment. I think really probably certainly in the next fortnight, 2 weeks today is certainly where we've been told and kind of come together that we think that is the time where we'll make our decision of whether Christmas will happen, just in terms of the scale of our panto, and obviously there's a couple of people on this call who have shows of equal scale and importance to their communities with those Christmas offerings. So I think that one we will know in early August, and it feels unlikely. I think at the moment it's not definite. We'd love it to happen, but I guess the realist in terms of if we then start to think about touring product and the availability of the largest scale shows that we had booked in, because the other thing, obviously everyone on this call who's managing a programming diary has basically moved things forward, moved them again, and tried to find ways to keep as many of the shows within the program as possible. There are certain shows that have pulled back, so my sense is probably February, March at the earliest is our sense. We don't know for sure. We hope it's Christmas, but best guess would be early March.
Well, thank you for being so honest about that. I think Christmas is a massive question, isn't it? Because so many pantos and Christmas shows have to start the build sort of early August, don't they, or around now. Any other thoughts on timings?
I'm happy to jump in. I mean, certainly the Trafalgar refurbishment is due to be finished in November. And so we too, like Birmingham, are looking at the potential of doing something over Christmas, because like everybody in the business, we would like Christmas to happen. I think also, and I'm sure everybody else on this call, is we don't know what audiences are going to come back, what capacities we're going to have, and how the social distancing in the audience is going to affect us. There have been so many different medical experts telling us about distancing that it's really difficult to know what the actual rules should be. But once we get some more clarity on that, I think we can be better able to work out what we can do. For our big touring shows, as Chris said, everything's been pushed on. To be frank, I think the big tours that we are talking about won't happen till probably February, March next year. And the only other thing is we have looked at the possibility of doing some concerts, because they're one-offs, they don't require sets and costumes, and that's still in discussion as if and when theatres open either in town or out of town. We could quickly put together a concert, because that would at least give something. But that's where we're at. We're just every week we move everything 2 months further on. And if I have to do one more budget, one more proposal, it's getting. I'm sure everybody's the same. You're just sort of going cross-eyed, and there's about one day every 3 weeks where I go, I can't do this anymore because it's not going to happen. But we just keep being positive. We have to just keep being positive.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. We're pretty much exactly what Chris and Joe said. As I mentioned earlier, we did decide to move our summer show, which is an in-house production of Rent, to later in the year. So that opens on the 31st of October. We do have about 2 weeks sort of leeway there that we could push it back if we had to, and run it sort of a little bit further into December towards Christmas. Obviously, we are a small venue, so that there's pros and cons to that. We're learning with regards to we need our 120 capacity because our shows break even at 90% plus. So for us, having any sort of reduced capacity in place or social distancing, we're already running at a loss for the production, which obviously is a massive risk then to the organisation. The current situation is that we're looking at a way of being able to make up that deficit and that lack of capacity. Whether that is, part streaming, part selling tickets. Again, it's a discussion that it's a discussion we're having at the moment with the rights holders. But I guess the big thing for us is we feel that there is a world that we could safely manage our audience side of things. And again, if this went ahead with regards to making up that deficit with some sort of streaming, then it's a goer. But really for us, it's how do we manage the backstage and how do we manage the cast? A lot of our performers the show's fully cast, and a lot of performers are not based in Manchester, so that does mean that they would be having to relocate here for the time being. We'd love to build one big house and have them all put up, and but obviously budgetary things don't always allow for that. So right now for us, we're sort of we're very much putting a lot of our focus into that side of it, and how our cast and creative and production team can feel safe during the run of the show. And again, like Joe said, I think Will's done multiple budgets for the show, and also we've moved it. We do have a date next year that if all else fails, we could move it to next year, but. And of course, there's the constant looming over us that we could get open and we could put all of that investment into the production, because ultimately when furlough ends, we need to be money coming in and we need content in the venue because we need people supporting. But the big fear is that if these local lockdowns that are looming over everyone, if they were to take effect, then you're in a real difficult position then.
Yeah, just to add into that, I think the issue for a lot of people is that these questions aren't actually about art or audiences anymore. They're financially based, and that's really difficult, because how do you prioritize the well-being of your cast and your crew, your front of house, your back of house, your box office, let alone your audiences, when you're also worrying that the government is going to make a snap announcement that you can do business again, and then the expectation falls on you as an organization. And I think there's a lot of boring stuff that a lot of people are just thinking about now. One is massively, what does social distancing mean for box office? One of the major issues we're going through at the moment is insurance. How do you insure anything right now? And who is willing to do that? Forget underwriting cancellation insurance, but just regular opening insurance seems to be quite a struggle. And I do understand that it's such a, we're constantly standing on shifting sands right now. But I do think, as welcome as the announcement of the DCMS money was last week, in my mind, it was a little bit too late for that. I think that a lot of people who run organizations and venues across the sector, we've been struggling with what is organizationally our priority, what is pastorally our priority for the people and audiences that we work with, and those where they're usually so aligned have been completely butting heads. And so it's really difficult to timeline anything without a more cohesive response. And I just think that hasn't really happened across the sector in terms of the ecology and ecosystem of things that go into creating work for a stage.
Thank you. Suzanne?
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's the question about programming is a real tough one, because programming naturally says that you have this plan that's in place that you can slot shows into, and you're kind of just moving them around. And we don't have a plan, because we don't have a society plan, let alone one for theatres, and that's what makes it really challenging. I think I totally agree with absolutely everything that everyone has said. And I think my only thing to add in is that, possibly that opportunity to look at programming differently and look at what theatre is slightly differently. Absolutely everything sadly comes down to money, and how we can make ourselves financially viable and sustainable throughout this. But also, we were, I think, as a nation at a point where we were ready for a discussion as to who theatre is for and what the role of theatre is. So my only hope in terms of negotiating what programming is going forward is that could also be part of the discussion. And we're all creative, so maybe there's a way of us to creatively have some reinvention of what theatre is, who it's for, who can engage, and how people can engage.
Thank you, Suzanne, and everyone. There's some brilliant responses there. I mean, building off what Suzanne was just saying, as the next question to all of the panelists, have you had any thoughts about, we know, relationships with people coming into a venue, bringing content to a program may well change. There was the mention from Joe about concerts being more viable perhaps than full productions initially, in terms of that sort of fleet of foot content. Many of you have already been moving content online in terms of engagement programs and those relationships. And there's been many conversations about building-based organizations looking at an outdoors offer as well, if that becomes more viable sooner. Is there anything further people would add about their hopes for how the relationship with program partners might change, co-producing partners? There's been a lot of conversations about potential evolution, about how we'd like to see the infrastructure, the ways of working together in the industry change. Are there any further thoughts about what you hope will shift in terms of what the relationship with a company who's going to be a co-producer or a content partner within the program might be different in the first few months once the venues reopen? Anyone wave at me if you'd like to. Is that a response from Yamin, please?
I can. I think partnership is a great term that is overused in theatre and not often followed through to its kind of fullest potential. And certainly this period of closure, I have been in contact with more artistic leaders and more organizations than ever before, really trying to look for not only solutions, but kind of innovation, I guess. So partnership absolutely will be key to how we evolve now. I think that one great outcome of this situation, which builds on the point that Suzanne was making earlier, is that as a sector, we're going to have to re-centralize how our audiences interact with the producing of theatre. And so just to break that down a little bit, I have been involved in a huge amount of conversations over the last few years of my appointment, where the art is fantastic, but nobody is sure who it's for. And I don't think as a sector that is a risk we can afford to take in this, particularly over the next kind of period where everybody's balances are going to be so tight to the wire. So in that respect, looking at who we're interacting with, who we're serving, what we're serving, and why we're serving it in the first place, if we can really centralize that in the creative process again and interrogate the art that we're creating as a sector, I think that could be an incredible and meaningful and impactful evolution for our industry.
Yes, Joan Well, please.
Hi, yeah, I mean, as we said about the way we sort of program it, we really do produce sort of 50% of the year, and then we receive work 50% of the year. And I think as sort of an organization and obviously a smaller venue, a lot of what we do tends to be sort of a platform for emerging artists and up and coming companies and things like that. And I think it's really going to be up to us and other organizations and lots of people on this panel as well to offer an opportunity, because obviously everyone's been affected by the current situation, and there's a lot of theatre makers and creatives and small companies that are unfunded and are going to really be struggling, and ultimately they need opportunity, a space to create, and also there might be a lot of empty venues. We can only speak for sort of our programming this year, and obviously and understandably every company pretty much has wanted to postpone their work to next year. So I think there's going to have to be an element of encouragement to sort of, we're now up and running in whatever capacity that might be, but whether we can't, put on a musical in this time, how about we do socially distanced or smaller capacity stuff? I'm not talking anytime soon, because like we said as well, the 1st of August is sort of like it came out of nowhere. And the thing is with live theatre is it really, you have to prepare and you have to rehearse, and it takes time to put these things on. And I think one of the benefits that potentially with this situation our audiences, when you mentioned about producing, is I think the second the tap's been turned off to live content and live theatre, all of a sudden the audience starts to realise what goes into these shows, and almost we've been sort of, spoiling our audiences with content and amazing work that they just turn up to and watch and think that's amazing, and they don't really appreciate the money and the amount of people backstage, creative teams, everyone that it takes to put that show on. So I'm hoping that when we come back, there'll be an element of sort of empathy from our audiences, that these things can't just suddenly turn a tap back on and all of a sudden every theatre is full again. And we've got to hope that, those audiences are going to come back and buy tickets and support their local venues. And again, it's one of those things we need to encourage new audiences through our doors. Because the older generation that have probably been sort of most of the loyal audience goers and theatre goers over the years, we need to encourage the next generation, because they might be less likely to
be the first ones back through the door. So yeah, also important. I think as well, just going off of what Yamin said as well, as an organisation, we are a real small fish sort of amongst this discussion, and we're really, really new, and Will and I were so
Oh, did we lose Joe and Will possibly there? I think we may have. Does anyone else want to respond until Chris, if you want to jump in?
Yeah, again, kind of reinforcing some of the things that are said there, and particularly Yamin's thoughts on partnership, I think. So my journey, as I said in the opening comments, it was very much through smaller organisations, and the importance of partnerships at that level does translate further up the chain if you hold true to it. And I guess some of the biggest successes that I've had at that smaller scale, and then as we've built on, through collaborations with our communities, with young makers, with all of that work, has been about inviting the audience in early into the process, and I think and trusting the audience and the artists being comfortable to go into that space as well, and go on that journey. And I think with emerging producers, I think with writers and teams that we're working with, I think that flexibility and that commitment to long-term development gives a structure for success, I think, a structure for mitigating risk together, and mitigating risk for the audience as well in that sense, I think, because they're getting to understand the space this work comes from. They're getting to be in near the beginning, feel like they've got a stake in that, build a relationship with artists, and then push forward to something that becomes really quite special is obviously the arc that we all hope it follows. But if nothing else, then people have already had an experience and a meaningful experience and a connection from the early stage, and so I think it could be that space of, in a way, actually tying lots of things that people have said back to the concerts, back to all of that sense, that there's something from the initial R&D through the concert, through to full show, through potentially even to scale up. And I think where that works even more so with a network of partners who work together to support that journey, a network of communities, audiences involved in connecting with each other, but also with that work and developing it, that can only build strength.
Absolutely. We're going to go to Joe in just a moment, but before first Joe and Will, did you want to finish your point, Joe, now you're back with us?
Sorry, I don't know what point you lost us, but
oh, sorry.
So yeah, no, it's fine. Carry on.
Okay, so back over to Joe from Trafalgar.
I just wanted to say that I really agree with everything everybody's saying. Although I work for, sorry, two terrible words, a commercial theatre company, we do value the art and the collaboration with smaller companies, with artists and projects of all sizes. The only thing I would say at this point, which is probably not for this discussion, but it's been part of a lot of discussions I've had with the League of Independent Producers, is I hope, and Chris aside, because Birmingham Hippodrome is not anything in this group, but I hope that the large commercial touring theatres will actually talk to producers more and take more of a partnership in the shows that are out on tour, rather than just trying to make as much money from us all as possible. Because, as has been said by other people, there are so many people involved in putting a show on, and it's been very clear from the things that have been said in the press about the arts and all those people behind the show, apart from the actors and directors, that make that show happen, from the box office staff, the backstage staff, the wardrobe staff, the cleaners, everybody. And everybody in a company works as hard as everybody else, and sometimes it's really depressing when you've got a very large show out on the road and everybody's working so hard, and the theatre that you are in does not work with you to make the show a success. And I hope that's the change that will come over the next year or so.
Indeed. And Suzanne?
Yeah, just to say that I think also with being a London venue and thinking about audiences, and particularly venues that are in the heart of their communities, I'd like to see some partnerships across London that allows us to take work to the different communities, particularly if we're looking at developing new audiences. It's really tricky for somebody who's never been to the theatre but knows about a show that's the other side of London, and to really, you know, take that risk in a way to go there to go and see that show, whereas actually there could be a really nice new network that happens, that we actually bring productions to people as opposed to making them travel to the work, particularly as well because of, you know, COVID-19 and coming out of that, and people just being a little bit worried about traveling to go and see shows.
Thank you. Really good points. Can we sort of carry on from that in terms of all of you talking about the sort of ideal partnerships you'd like to see forming? Thinking about so many of our audience will be independent producers, artists, possibly commissioning work, and also a question that we've got coming from Grayscale Theatre Company, who are in the audience. That what can individual artists or producers that are developing new work, what can they bring to you? And I guess how would you want those partnerships approached from the other side? You know, I think particularly in the context of new musicals, which we all know takes so much development and takes so much time and an awful lot of conversations, what would be helpful for you as venues to hear from producers and artists as we come out of this?
Yeah, I mean, we obviously, it's one of those things that we love hearing from emerging companies and emerging writers. One thing that we always look out for when starting discussions with new projects and new work is, again, it's like, although we're a smaller sort of non-for-profit sort of venue, and not certainly in the commercial world because we are smaller, we do like to think of things always commercially first, especially with new musicals. We believe it's really important that even as a writer of that piece, or the first producer of that piece, it's really important to have an idea and then a sort of even a pencil journey for that piece, and looking at what that piece could achieve, where you think that would sit within the current marketplace, I guess, for musicals, who's the audience demographic, the branding behind the show. You know, I always say to sort of emerging writers as well, is like, look at what else is out there. There might not be a musical that's similar, which is always a positive, but look at the other musicals out there, and look at things like Wicked, look at the branding behind it, and imagine, you know, obviously ultimately musicals are expensive to produce when you produce them no matter what scale. So you need tickets to be sold, and you need an audience, and then a demographic. So we always think of sort of, have a plan, where do you see that show going, and think about the branding, the marketing materials. Just start to think of how you could sell this piece. What is your sort of, what are those things when you come down to the marketing and the PR about that show?
Great, thank you. Anybody else?
I think it's going to be really difficult for creatives and producers of new work to approach a lot of the larger commercial and subsidized sector houses and producing organizations. I think it's going to be really, really tough. I think a lot of us, particularly with the overheads of venues, are going to be massively risk averse, going to have to be, with no choice. It's a slightly sideways answer to that question, but I think that what we have to do is ensure that there is enough pressure on the sector where the larger organizations, such as myself, such as Birmingham, such as Trafalgar, rally around, support and protect organizations like Hope Mill Theatre and Theatre Peckham. Because my major concern as a producer and receiving house is what happens to new work? What happens to small regional tours? How are we really supporting emerging creatives and artists? And the bigger houses, the bigger organizations, we're not going to have the capacity to do that. not forget seats just in terms of production on costs. I think that a lot of producers will be looking for safe bets for at least a short period of time. So I think for those of us that are in receipt of Arts Council money, for those of us that post a healthy surplus, and particularly if you're a national portfolio organisation, there should actually be new boxes to be ticked in terms of what collaborating, if you're large, collaborating with mid and small, and kind of collaborating down the scale looks like, to ensure that these smaller organizations are protected as much as possible.
That's great. I hope that works. That's a great vision for how we need to be working together. Thanks, Suzanne.
Yeah, I was going to say that, you know, what I have is a venue, a 200-seat venue. So for people out there who are making work, want to try out work, then it's a perfect space for that. And even coming out of this time, it's a perfect space for that. And I think that, you know, just as Yamin has said about the support that bigger organizations could give to smaller organizations to then support, it's like a trickling down, that, you know, a smaller organization who can champion the work of a new company can be an absolutely brilliant way for that company to then have a stepping stone onto moving on to a bigger venue. Yeah, that's what, you know, thinking back to that initial question of what can artists do, I think seek out organizations that are the size of, you know, the 200-seat and smaller venues.
I guess just to kind of come into that space between both of those answers, if you like. So we were in a very strong position before everything hit, and part of that strength was because we're an independent venue without Arts Council subsidy. So in a way we could be free to respond, and had a little more financial freedom to respond, and be bold, actually. So I guess the biggest challenge that's going to affect us is probably, you know, given the flip of that, of course, is that throughout this period there's no subsidy that's been able to support the period between closure and whenever we can reopen. And obviously we hope something will come out of the government package, but effectively all we've done is spend our reserves to stay closed, really, and to keep as many people in jobs as we can. So I guess what might change is our cash that we have free to invest certain things, because the model of the business is all entirely reliant on the money that we make from the main stage to then support our development initiatives, to support all of those things that go alongside it. So we might have slightly less cash. It doesn't mean we've got less space in terms of the studio presentation space, and also in the development space. And I guess what it doesn't reduce is the ability and skills of our team. And if anything, it might free up some of the time from that team that would normally have been diverted towards generating increased incomes so that we can also support the development work. In a time, there might be some more time, there's definitely the expertise. So I think be flexible in your request, be open to see how you can work together and what we can bring beyond money. You know, obviously we will bring money wherever we can to help through commissioning, to help through production, but think of the skills that are in that organisation and think about what could we ask for from that side, from people who are developing and working on those bigger branding moments, from people who are directly out there engaging with communities, think what we can bring on that side. And I guess it's also about just being flexible around how your show might realise at which stage of its development, and be open to partnership and invention without changing your product, because it's your product, it's your vision for how you want to move it forward, but be open to how that might land and in what stages. And stay bold, I think, although we will be perhaps on the larger shows and economically less able to commit to risk. I think in terms of where we live, the city we live in, the people we serve, the kind of work we want to be associated with, and the doors we want to open for people, I'd say stay fresh, stay inventive, stay bold, because actually I think there's probably more chance of that work standing up, being noticed, connecting, being relevant, than maybe representing things that have been around for a long time.
Great, thank you. Jo?
I thank you. Everybody said everything that's very relevant, especially Jo and Will. In the commercial sector, I think that people who are writing new work have to be realistic about the audience that it's going to appeal to. It's really important. But I think in the commercial sector, what I think going forward is that we have to have more collaborators. So a particular project might have, say, 3 or 4 collaborators. It might start at Hope Mill, it might then go to Birmingham Hippodrome, it might have a const in between, it might then end up being toured by Trafalgar. I think we're all going to have to look at collaborating and building the project from a small one to its final size. As Yamin said, it's actually going to be about finances, and especially for like Birmingham and us, people who don't get subsidy. Whilst we did have cash before COVID, it's going to be more difficult now. But if we can find enough partners to make it work, the project itself is worth doing. And I think the audiences, I think they will be open to anything that, as Chris said, is bold and new. There are different audiences for different projects. You know, if we were all the same, then it would be very boring. There's a huge number of different audiences, and I don't think any of us should turn down anything. We need to look at every single kind of project that comes to us, but we're going to have to be more careful about how we choose them because of funding. But I think with the right partnerships, we can hopefully make it happen.
Thank you all. Some fantastic responses there. So much food for thought. I think building on all of your responses just there, if we're thinking about many of the people listening into this conversation who might be developing a new musical, either as a writer or a producer or a director, a dramaturg, building on your responses so far, have you got any further thoughts about how they might build partnerships with those audiences, or how in these circumstances there might be things they can do to make a new musical more viable in terms of bringing an audience with it in some way, because there's already a relationship there? Thinking ways that we sort of mitigate risk, as has been discussed before, in a time of increased or rather reduced appetite for risk because of the financial realities many venues are facing. We know one thing is having a musical that has a tiny artistic team. If it's a two-hander, then it's perhaps less risky to stage, but I think no one wants a world full of only two-hander musicals. So are there other things that you think of in terms of people bringing a new musical to a venue that might help to make it more viable in this future sort of chapter that we're entering into, in terms of audiences or in terms of other things that creatives might do to make a show more viable to venue partners coming on board with them? Yes, Jo and Will.
I think what's been really interesting, I guess, that because of the closure of theatres and venues, is that obviously there's been a map. Hello? You hear me? Yeah. And obviously, you're fine. Okay. I was just about to say a point which might completely now be off the table of what I'm about to say. But what I was going to say was that now everything, you know, we sort of been forced to take everything online and digitally. And I guess that, you know, again, there's pros and cons to that. And it's been interesting for the online content we've put out, that really just analysing that engagement and what works best. I definitely am a massive advocate for live theatre all the way, but we you know, we've had to stay engaged with our audiences and with our community, and we've had to do that online. But what that's meant is that we've opened up to a wider demographic. We've opened up to younger people, you know, who are sort of very much the social media generation. So I think that for companies, you know, right now and maybe for the foreseeable, looking at that as a model in the sense that, you know, how can you engage your product, your show, with online, and how can that be, you know, so when theatres are back up and running, you know, looking at ways of, you know, do you release a cast album or a recording of new work, you know, on social media, on iTunes, get a little bit of buzz around it, get people knowing your style, sort of getting a love for your material, and then going, oh, you like that? Well, actually, now we have a workshop at Hope Mill Theatre for one night, you know, like come along and see it. And, you know, so actually sort of, you know, one thing that could come out of this is definitely that the new work and bold work is still being done digitally, which I think is great as well.
I just add very quickly, I mean, it's been touched upon the call a few times in terms of especially getting a musical off the ground. But in terms of with new work, especially musical theatre, you know, these things do take time, and sort of imagine a journey for that show. And it might start with a table read, like Joe says, and we might go back to when musicals were formed from your concept albums, like Jesus Christ Superstar and shows like that, and actually they had an audience before they took to the stage. I think that's really important to just try and think of these new and sort of key ways that we can be essentially gathering an audience without putting it onto full production straight away.
I think, yeah, just to add into that, I think now that we can rehearse again, now that we can get together to actually start working towards projects again, yeah, as Joe and Will were saying, I'm not entirely convinced that we've created a solution with moving all of our work online at Hackney Empire. There are certain demographics and communities that online work just doesn't reach in the same way that practical live work does. But in terms of internally, I think showcases, rehearsed readings, etc., and kind of trying to pitch new work in a digital space could be fantastic. There are many pieces and showcases that I've missed because of not being able to get somewhere in London or regionally in time. If we could now just formally have digital representation in the room, knowing that there will be some give and take in terms of the quality of the stream, etc., being able to try to pitch and sell your work to a much wider range of potential producers or collaborators could be an incredible step forward. And in terms of what Joe Benjamin was saying earlier, yeah, if we're going to collaborate, that might be a fantastic space to be able to do so. If we're, you know, just setting up a GoPro or a 2-camera shoot in somebody's studio or rehearsal room to start showcasing new work, we might really be able to democratize potential producers' access to new work and new platforms.
Yes, Joe.
I think what Yamin says is absolutely true. I'm lucky enough to be on the board of MMD, and we did an amazing competition a couple of weekends ago online, the Sars and Drew New Song Prize. And I have to say, given the limitations, it was the most amazing evening, and I got a hell of a lot out of it just watching these songs and seeing them being performed by amazing performers and wanting to know more about the musical. And I think, like Yamin, there are so many times there's a workshop and I can't get to it because it's the other side of London or I've got a meeting or something. But if some of these workshops could be done online, then there's so much more potential to get producers or investors to just watch it, even if they watch half an hour of it. It gives them an access to this work, because it's so difficult to know what gets people's imagination. I mean, you know, who knew that a show about cats would be so successful? You know, you just don't know what's going to get them. and it's a magical thing when it happens, and we need to just keep making sure it happens. That's all.
Absolutely, yes. Just looking at questions that are coming in from our audience. And we've talked about this a little bit, but there's a question from Joe Partridge about the possibilities of collaborating. Oh, sorry, no, I wasn't going to pick that one up. It was Steve Corner's question, there we go, which is about theatres almost forming like a ring of theatres where the in-house shows can be shared, recommended, and where even profits could be shared. Now, obviously, we have existing networks, but I'm wondering whether there are thoughts about sort of building again on what Yamin and Suzanne have talked about sharing shows or better networks or ways of connecting that could come out of this. Possibility, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess just to say that pre this current situation we all find ourselves in, I'd been having similar conversations like that with the Lowry, with ourselves, people who have that kind of 200-seat size space, with Royal and Derngate in Northampton, with Curve, to try and see if there are ways we could do something, at least to commit to projects up front in the way that a lot of rep theatres co-produce, I guess, and support and pre-book the tour in that way, but seeing it at a development phase. So we'd started to have some of those conversations. Obviously, we've all got to assess the kind of financial fallout of where we are, but I know that the spirit is strong to try and build some of those networks to help work be seen, have more performances, therefore generate more income and give it more of a chance of success.
Great, thank you, Chris. Yeah, Joe and Will.
Hi, yeah, I mean, we've talked, and Yamin mentioned this earlier on, actually, just the beauty of lockdown in a way, although obviously so many other things we've talked about, but one of the benefits for us has just been the time to connect with lots of other theatre makers, a lot of other organisations, big, small, and we've actually been in several conversations with different theatre makers and venues at different sizes about networks. So I think there's a lot of things sort of bubbling under the surface at the moment, and one of them was sort of like a smaller, more regional, smaller theatre venue network to sort of encourage the smaller tours and touring, and again to ideally make budgets work a little bit better. The second you have a few, even for smaller theatre companies, the second you have a few venues attached, it makes the figures on paper start to write a little bit nicer than just 1 week somewhere. And so there was that as a sort of, and again, we're hoping that it might grow into something, very early stages at the moment, but really important for new work as well, because obviously there are a lot of bigger venues, like Chris has said as well, that do have smaller studio venues, and they tend to not be programmed most of the year. And it might just be a really great way of utilising all those spaces and developing new audiences and that type of thing.
And also going off of what Will said as well, we've been in Manchester coming up in 5 years now, and although with regards to the sort of smaller independent theatre scene is not as sort of big and varied as it is in London, there, in the past 5 years, Manchester's landscape, independent theatre landscape has changed so much, and it's starting to really thrive, which is really exciting, and it's taking that long, and only recently have we really reached out, although we're very aware of the smaller venues in the city and the work that they do, and we all, there is a sense of community, but what it's like when you're sort of every day just head down and trying to make your own venue work. You don't always get those opportunities to sort of talk about the future, and it's been a great time for us to come together and within the city and talk to those smaller theatres and producing theatres in the city and say, is it time that we looked at a network where the smaller theatres could be represented in a way still within the city, and those decisions that are being made with regards to our local authority and just having a voice at those tables. And so I think that's definitely something, networks and real collaborations and sharing the risk that's going to help all of us, it seems, not just, you know, the big number one venues but the smaller venues as well, feel like there's a way out of this where we can get back to what we were doing, create an opportunity and etc.
Suzanne, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say that I think it's really important for us to be in a place where we can have networks that will allow us all to be more agile. I mean, and thinking about, from my audience, don't buy tickets in advance, let alone months in advance. And that's always a scary place to be, because you're living right up to the day wondering, are people going to come? But actually, to be in some form of network which allows something to be able to be programmed in at a relatively you know, within a relatively short space of time, because there's an opportunity and there's an opening, and because I think definitely my audience miss out on shows that are you know, around in London because they haven't pre-booked months in advance to something that they really want to see. And to be able to just bring something in at a relatively last minute would be fantastic for the local community that I serve.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? That kind of, so one element is that hierarchies have kind of gone during this time, but also if we can get rid of secrecy, I think we'll be in a much, much better place, rather than people kind of almost holding on to the precious thing that they're programming. Actually, we all need each other. We all need, as venues and producers and makers, to be going, actually, to be sharing and being collaborative is going to be so much more productive, or could be the route to survival, really. Thank you, really interesting points. James.
Yes, we've got a question from Karen Maloney here about schools, relationships with schools. She's asking, can you tell us a bit more about how your work with schools has been affected? And I guess we can expand that out into work with young people, if you feel that's a more relevant area to answer. But anyone that would like to start us off on that? Yamin's nodding his head. No?
I mean, I'm good to start with
Chris,
schools.
please.
Yeah,
Yes.
and because I think it's different in each of our settings. So our most established work outside of the venue is through our schools network. It's something we put an awful lot of work into over the last 2 years, particularly. And so ours is a really deep model with schools, in the sense that we have a member of staff in the school setting every single week of the year with each of the 28 partner schools that we work with. And we were unsure what would happen with that, really, in this situation. Again, a little bit into that sense of the subsidised and the non-subsidised and that space, and actually about the, I guess, the length of time and the history of the infrastructure of that being in the organisation. So we kind of completed the Easter term, if you like, the spring term, with delivery into the schools, and then we produce resources for the summer term, and we're available for not so much kind of online delivery, but online communication, Q&As, those kind of things through this period, while obviously looking at current staffing models, who could be on furlough, the support we could get, all of that, really. The big surprise really came, and it was you know, it felt great, because it meant that the impact was being recognised of the work, because, you know, the vast majority of our work is in, as with many of the people on this call, I'm sure would agree, you put your resources into the areas that need you most. And so it was very much in our, you know, most deprived communities economically in the city, and around, and we were really shocked that they actually said, no, we want to sign up for our whole year starting again in September. We want, you know, they pay a financial contribution, but obviously it's massively subsidized from the money that we earn on stage. We'd also raised a good bit in advance, and our board backed it, because it was the thing that takes our venue right out into the communities of our city and connects with its people, whether or not they have the ability or desire to come through the doors of the theatre building. And so all 28 partner schools have signed up for us to go back in from September, majority of it physically. A couple of schools still want it to be digital until after the October half term, but they have really seen the importance of of the arts and creativity for their young people in terms of building back their confidence, their skills, their communication. What we do will change. It's not going to be so much about shows in the first, and kind of performance skills. All of that will come through it, but a big focus will be around on well-being, mental health, processing recent circumstances, and trying to imagine a better future where they can be more active agents moving forward in shaping things. So it's very much coming from that space. Our participation program, apart from we're kind of doing monthly masterclass things, but other than that, it's much slower build because it was earlier in its journey and wasn't quite as established. So that's probably that'll come back when we can, really, in probably in 21 though, unfortunately.
Amazing, but it sounds really hopeful. It's fantastic. Joe and Will.
As I mentioned earlier, obviously we made the decision to transition into a charitable organisation last year, and one of those reasons, along with many, was to really engage with young people in our community and within Manchester. We have a primary school a stone's throw away from the theatre, and they've never been through our doors. It's not for want of trying, but we've also probably not had the resources to be able to really engage with them and offer that sort of opportunity for them to really engage with us. And that was one of the reasons why we really saw it as an important move for our organisation. And I actually went into a careers day there last year, and they had, I think, 20 of us from all different, different areas of industry and nurses, and 5 of us sat on the stage, and the children had to guess what we did. And I was left sitting there for a long time after they had guessed what everyone else did, and none of them could say anything to do with theatre. And I just found it so eye-opening, because they just had never thought about it, and it's not something that they had ever been in their remit. And I think it was a real turning point for us as we were going through that transition to say this is so important that we do this, because ultimately, not only for the future of theatre with regards to theatre goers, but also the future of theatre with regards to the theatre makers of the future, and engaging with young children, and making it as diverse as possible, because all young children, no matter what their background, they need to feel like the arts is accessible to them, and they'll only feel like that if they are in theatres and venues, engaging with theatre makers themselves. And a big part for us is also offering, internships for children to be able to come in and experience as much as possible all sides of the theatre industry, and that includes box office management, and because these are the real jobs. And I think that for us really going forward, that engagement with young people and schools in our area is a big part of our remit.
Thank you, that's great. Suzanne.
Yeah, I'm on a real challenge to get young people into enjoying theatre independently, kind of aside from coming to theatre as a big school group. I think that sometimes is the first point that a young person comes in, they experience through a school trip, but I'm really excited by how do we really reach out and excite individual children to be independently interested in coming to theatre. And I guess one of the big challenges with us all thinking about our digital work that we've done, and like I said, we've done that at Theatre Peckham. We quickly transferred work to digital to keep that engagement going with young people, but digital is not the answer. The difference of communicating with young people via the classes that we've done digitally are completely different to having them in the room and them expressing themselves. And there's a certain level of trust that they achieve from that in-person experience that they have with us that we just can't get through the lens. Also thinking about young people at home in their, you know, whatever their circumstances at home, trying to being a room doing a voice class and having their brothers and sisters in the next room, whatever, it doesn't, it's not the answer at all. And really, and the other side is that for all of those young people who don't have that as an option, we've had parents crying to us saying that we just, you know, I just don't have the means to allow my, you know, or the equipment to have my child doing a class at home, because we just don't have the equipment to do that. And that's really sad. I mean, we've done a thing where we've, you know, posted activity packs out to over 300 homes to get young people to have something creative to do. So I guess my point is that digital just isn't the answer. It's something for now because it's getting us through. But actually what we do need is we need to get young people back in and socially integrating with each other in a place that they feel, where they feel comfortable, where they can express themselves, where they can be creative and really start to develop.
I think there's a whole other conversation there in terms of putting things online does not make things accessible. It just puts them online. If we don't change the terminology and lexicon of how we talk about theatre in all creative arts or performing arts or arts and culture in all of its forms, we are not actually making things more accessible. Yet, as Suzanne was saying, digital poverty is a real thing and almost impossible to counteract. We tried to preload data onto SIM cards so that people could engage with our online programs. But as it goes, if you live in the middle of an estate, your reception's not always that great. And go into the communal green space, which often isn't that green, probably isn't, as Suzanne said, the best place to do a vocal class. James, as you said, I think it's absolutely right to create a differentiation between schools and between young people. They're completely different things. Our work with schools obviously ground to a halt. We work in every school pretty much across Hackney and a huge amount of schools across North and East London. But that wasn't where our priorities lay either. As Suzanne said, again, understanding the types of situations and environments many young people from areas like Hackney and Haringey were going into by being at home 7 days of the week became a massive priority. So we started working with emergency housing, food banks, social services to try to create a signposting infrastructure for a lot of the young people that we worked with. Going forward, going back to schools, it's going to be really, really complicated, and it all wraps around back to Panto in many respects, actually. Most young people who I meet in primary schools, when I have the opportunity and privilege of being able to do a bit of outreach for Hackney Empire, say that their first experience of Hackney Empire was the Panto, almost invariably. It's such an important first step for so many communities. And as Chris was saying earlier, if that's not able to happen because schools aren't doing trips or because Pantos don't exist for 6 to 9 months, what does that mean for a whole generation of first-time users and experiences? So currently what we're looking at is going back to kind of more old-fashioned TIE models. Are there models that we can actually send into schools and young people's organizations to create experiences of theatre, but are small and agile and also resilient in the case of being somebody in the cast or somebody in the company catching coronavirus? If you're going into a school, you are just going to be faced with more potential infection. So we're just exploring those types of models to look at how we can engage going forward.
Sorry,
Go ahead, and Joe.
myself. Trafalgar is obviously a very young company. We don't have a resource within Trafalgar Studios to work with local schools, but what we've been doing is working with, certainly when we have shows on tour, working with the theatres that we play in and doing workshops for children one morning of the week when we're in the theatre, and combining that with them seeing the show and having a chat with the company afterwards, having done a workshop in the morning. So it's an experience, but I totally agree that it's sometimes beyond the financial resources of a lot of people. And I'm pretty passionate about getting young people to see theatre. I ran a festival of musical theatre some years ago, and we worked with over 3,000 children over the period of time I run that organisation. And it's amazing to see, especially for children who don't have a huge academic ability, and they find something they can do, they can find their self-esteem. And it's, as Yamin was saying, it's something that they can get hold of, and they're not sitting at home on an estate or in a situation which is maybe dangerous for them. And the only thing, I mean, as our company grows, we've already incorporated Stagecoach into our organisation, but I'm hopeful that we can do more work within schools, either with a show that's on tour or in some other way. But again, to explain, as Joe and Will did, to two people, that there are jobs in this industry. You don't have to be an actor. There's so many other jobs that you could get involved in. And especially for diverse communities, the only way we can get our industry more diverse is to start from the bottom up, to go into the schools, to explain to them about our industry, to get them interested at that age. And that's what we all need to be doing. And I'm really passionate that we do it. And it's difficult, and especially in the current situation, as others were saying about going into schools at this time. But I'm hopeful that once things get back to some new normal, we can continue this journey.
Yes, absolutely. A hugely important part of audiences for now and for the future, as you've said. Thank you, panel. So I'm not sure if we'll have time for everyone to answer this question that's come in, but we have a question from Corey Reynolds that I guess brings us back to many of the artists and producers who'll be here in our audience about the best route to actually submitting and securing a pitch. So I don't know if there is if we've got some responses to that, the best possible route. Got any thoughts? Thank you, Joe and Will.
Emily, I guess you mean with regards to getting your work programmed or just seen and heard? Is that sort of what we're?
I think so. I think it's that sense of how can I get my idea listened to?
Yeah, I mean, every organisation is going to have their own way of how they sort of, they find work. A lot of it, obviously, as we were discussing, maybe collaborations with other venues, with artists, that sort of thing. But if I speak with regards to Hope Mill Theatre and sort of ways that we're thinking of changing programming going forward, up until this point, it's very much been, submission process through our website, and I spend the end of every week going through everything that's come through. Some of that is just, can we hire your space and put on the show? And some of it is, please help me with this. And we're a very small team. I mean, we're the biggest team we've been since we opened our doors, but we're still a very small team. So obviously we're very stretched a lot of the time, but going forward, we've been looking at ways of how we can help with new work and how we program. One of the ways that I've sort of been looking at and discussing with our theatre manager is looking at sort of pitching opportunities. So I guess a bit like, you guys do, which is, I've been on your panel before, for Beam Festival, which sort of inspired me a little bit. Because I have to admit, I do find it hard when I just send a script or a range of songs or a length, and it's sort of, you have to watch this. And I think that sometimes it's hard to really get a feel for that, the passion of that project. And again, like we discussed, the sort of journey that person might see it going on, or exactly what they need. You know, it might just be a writer that says, look, I need a director. And I think that sometimes that's hard to get off of just off of an email. So we have been looking at ways of maybe having some sort of programming pitches where people come in over a few days, and they have a slot, and I get to actually engage with that writer about that piece and what they're looking for. And that's sort of one way that we've been looking at expanding in the future.
I would just add quickly as well, in terms of you don't need to just pitch organisations as in that run buildings. We know of, especially Manchester, with the sort of the culture and the sort of theatre scene that is there. There's lots of sort of smaller organisations that are not based in buildings, but sort of specialise in new and emerging works. And there's one off the top of my head, which is called ADP, and that gives opportunities, and they basically put evenings together where there might be 8 new pieces of work that are showcased. It might just be a portion of the show, but they'll be showcased, and they'll get actors together, and it's script in hand, and it's essentially just giving it a read. So the writer and producers are invited, and creators are invited. So it's an opportunity. But there are lots of other organisations in Manchester, and I'm sure there's lots in London and regionally around the country as well. But also have a look and a Google for other sort of organisations that specialise in new work, because there's lots of opportunities there as well.
And I guess as well, maybe smaller theatre companies as well that maybe are looking for content, and maybe their remit is new writing. You know, I know in Manchester there's a lot of new writing theatre companies, but you know, with regards to a musical, you know, they might have never thought of a musical before. So to think about these little small independent companies that are, you know, working sort of project by project basis. You know, think about reaching out to them.
And that just comes to the point we've talked about a lot during this conversation, is actually relationships, reaching out, partners. And sometimes when you're trying to get something off the ground and it's just yourself trying to do that, it's really difficult. So reach out. There's lots of networking pages on Facebook and things like that. Reach out and maybe find an emerging producer that, even if they're not putting money in, they might just half that sort of, you know, not the risk essentially, but energy that it sometimes is required to get these projects off the ground. Yeah.
Right.
I guess, yeah, so I was just going to say, from my end, I'd say try and be specific, try and be clear why you're approaching that partner. And I think if there's something in there that feels like you know the audience, or you know the space, or you know what you think that venue could bring to it, but also what you could bring to the venue. I think if there's those little things that make it feel specific, they can make a lot of difference in cutting through a sea of emails.
Great, thank you. James, do you want to pick up the next one?
Yeah, so we've got a question here from Michael Clulo asking about audiences, asking what are theatre's plans to entice audiences back into theatres? What sort of new work do you think might help this process? I mean, expanding on, I guess, you know, some of us are hoping that with some of the forecasts for future years, maybe new musical theatre will be having an increased demand in terms of audiences' appetite, particularly the emotional catharsis that we've all experienced if we've been lucky enough to sit through really good new musical theatre that really moves you, that there's something there that people have an increased need for as they're moving forwards. And in times of financial challenge, historically, we've seen musicals become more popular with audiences sometimes. So any thoughts on either in relation to musical theatre or more generally about what your plans are for both for audiences feeling keen to book and to come back to the programme when the venues are open again? Anyone who'd like to start us off on that? Yep, Jo and Will.
I would just say, obviously, yeah, like you say, musical theatre and new work in general. One thing I would probably avoid, but again, it's all personal preference, is COVID and lockdown related content. I think this is something that we may wish to look back on in the future, but I think at this stage, in terms of content, I think people want an element of escapism, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be all, you know, happy and jolly, but it's certainly taking audiences' minds somewhere else, whether that's to move them in another way, but something else. I think time is a great healer. And I would just say, just from, you know, even the sort of contact we've had with our audiences, obviously from a distance and online and things like that, is people aren't keen at the moment to be reminded of what we're currently in and what we've just been through. That's what I would say.
I would totally agree with Joe and Will. I think that audiences do want to be entertained. I don't necessarily, whilst I'm personally think feathers and sequins are probably what we need, I might be wrong, but I do think that, for instance, Come From Away, which I think is one of the most amazing, emotionally engaging musicals I've seen in 20 years, if it had actually happened the year after September the 11th, it wouldn't have had the same impact. I think the impact 20 years on is amazing. And I think, you know, new writers maybe think about writing a musical about COVID, but perhaps not do it for the next 10 years. I'm not saying that musicals with messages shouldn't be done. I absolutely think that's relevant. But I think certainly for the next 2 years, even with a message, and in fact, I believe this passionately at all times, the musical has to engage the audience. And that's the way you get your message put over a lot better. And it might be new, it might be old, but I think there will be an audience for musicals. Certainly the surveys that are currently being done amongst that certain theatres are doing are showing that there is an audience that wants to come back. I think somebody said it earlier on in the discussion, but we all are worried that the older audience, which is mainly a musical theatre audience, may be the last to come back. Certainly in London, I think it may be different in the regions. I mean, in London, we've got to contend not only with everything else that's going on, but the fact that they've increased congestion charge and put it on to 11 o'clock at night, which is going to hit the West End horrendously. But I think the audiences, I mean, we as theatres just have to engage with our audience and persuade them to come back, I think.
Thank you. And Suzanne?
Yeah, I think there's a real opportunity to look at what musical theatre is and to expand its form. And I'm really excited by a new opportunity coming forward of that. People who maybe haven't considered musical theatre as a form or have preconceived ideas of what it could be, coming together and collaborating and making some interesting and new work. Also, I mean, this period of time, you know, from COVID-19 has shown up lots of different things in lots of different ways. Disparities experienced within the Black community, the disparities in terms of class in the UK. And I think that there are some, again, really interesting opportunities to be explored around that as well, so that musical theatre that can be thought of for a particular group of people, actually we could throw that idea up in the air and start to find some new and interesting new ways of making work.
And just to echo what Suzanne's saying there, that's an area of particular interest from us, so I'll reach out to you, Suzanne, afterwards as well.
Thank you. Yeah,
if I may just quickly, I think, yeah, obviously I agree with everything that everybody said just now. From an administrative point of view, I think we have to kind of, as theatres, we have to change this bizarre ideology that theatre is the most likely place that you can catch coronavirus in the world, and that's why it has to be the last place to open. So we're going to have to do a lot of work administratively, logistically, to create this idea that theatre can be a safe space, or at least as safe as a pub. From an internal point of view, we're actually looking at shorter pieces. So we're wondering whether or not an audience who might not want to sit in the same space for a 2.5-hour musical, would they be more willing to engage in an hour-long piece without an interval? You sit down, you get up, you leave, all of that, and it's very clean, it's very easy to do. And whether we can explore 2 show day models with that, but both with not a mat and an evening, but 2 evening performances based on a shorter running time. So I think that there's going to have to be a lot of just rethinking and experimentation, and I think there will be an element of kind of first out of the gate, so a kind of communal learning process for all of us as we watch other people try things, make mistakes, do incredibly amazing kind of revolutionary things, and try to adjust accordingly.
Great. Oh, thank you so much. There've been so many inspiring thoughts there. And I think for our last question, it'd be lovely to hear from each of you what you're most looking forward to when this new world does open up, when these new pieces of work are happening, these new partnerships. So yes, if you could share with us something that you're excited about the future, that would be a lovely optimistic note to finish on.
Yeah, I'll go first.
Thank you.
Hackney Empire, like I said, is a 119-year-old theatre, and for the vast majority of that lifetime, it's never been empty, regardless of whether it was a theatre or a bingo hall. And certainly in my lifetime of experience with Hackney Empire, I've never seen the place deserted. And the last 6 months have just made me realise how meaningless a theatre is when it's not full of people of all kinds, in terms of audiences and creatives and all the people that go into the ecology of making theatre. So I am looking forward to these spaces, which are just bricks and cement and wood otherwise, being occupied and filled and inhabited again. Hackney Empire, and I know everybody will say this about their venue, the buzz is different when it's full of people. It feels just like a void, like a bottomless well when there's not people there. I'm most looking forward to that first audience, that first set of creatives that come back in and are able to use the space as it was intended.
Yeah, the energy will be amazing when that happens. Who's next? Thanks, Will and Joe.
Yeah, a couple of things going off what Yamin said. I mean, for the first 3 years of Hope Mill, because we really couldn't afford staff, Will and I pretty much worked on the front line. We were seeing our audiences face to face pretty much nearly every night, whether that was working on the bar or opening front of house and tearing tickets. And so having that one-to-one engagement with people again, and with our loyal audiences and hopefully our new audiences, is going to be an incredible feeling. And I never thought I'd ever see the day that I would say I can't wait to work on the bar again, which will be really exciting. And I think also going off of what Suzanne said is that I think that this has given this time of darkness is giving us a time to really reflect on what our industry is and what culture means. And I think that in a positive way, it's going to look completely different going forward. And I think that that's a good thing. And I look forward to how that is going to evolve, and for not only the whole industry, but our organisation as well, and how we operate. Do you want to add anything?
I mean, I agree with everything you've just said. One of the things that in the early days, if someone turned up to the theatre to see a show and they'd gone, "How long have you been here?" We'd say a couple of years, and then they go, "I've never heard of you before." We used to get quite upset, but I think actually we're going to look forward to more and more people who've never heard of us, never been before, and whether they've seen something online or something, I don't know, someone said. We're excited to welcome new people through the door. And just again, like Yamin said, I cannot wait to be in a rehearsal process, whether it's, getting hand sanitizer for the stage management or whatever that may be, and being surrounded by all these people that we're so lucky to be surrounded by, creative minds and open-minded, amazing people. And then all of a sudden we've been behind our screens. So I can't wait to be in a room with creatives and actors and everything. I just can't wait.
Absolutely. Suzanne?
Yeah, I was going to say, well, a lot of our work that we do is that we produce is about working with young people or producing work that's for young people. And so I'm really excited about having those energies come back into the room again. I think that as challenging as this time has been, there's going to be some really exciting and interesting conversations to come from the mouths of young people, and for them to express those with us, and then being able to turn that into something positive and creative, and then have the ability to platform that on a stage. I just think that's going to be really exciting, because I'm just interested in what their opinions are. There's been so much stuff on the TV, in media, all of that is clouding everything, plus being at home and having I know what it was like when I was a child, just taking on my parents' opinion and not having a space to actually just express that for myself. So bringing all of that into a room and then platforming it at stage, I just think is so exciting.
Yeah. Chris?
For me, it's building back. So I said right at the top of the call that, you know, for 100 and probably, you know, there's been isolated brilliant moments in the theatre's history around its engagement with its communities, but particularly over the last 5 years, the organisation has shifted and has started that process. And only really, I would say, in the last probably 2 years have we reached that point, last 18 months to 2 years have we reached that point where we've started to make the impact and the relationships and the partnerships for our city and region that we can. We've hit this hiatus. So I'm actually, I'll say this in brackets, but I'm kind of excited for fundraising so that I can make this happen again, and that we can renew and review everything, like others are saying, so that we can get back as soon as we possibly can to being able to serve the communities and our audiences in as deep and as wide a way as we had just arrived at. So and to push further.
Thank you. And Jo?
I'm sorry, I'm going to be very selfish and very personal. I've been in this industry for 47 years, and a lot of time people ask me why I do it, what do I get out of it? You're not on stage, you're not getting the applause. But what I get out of it is standing at the back of an auditorium, watching an audience enjoy a show that I've had a hand in making happen. And my raison d'etre for every show I do is that I stand there on the opening night and say there's nothing else I personally could have done to make the show any better. And for me to see an audience go out of a theatre having enjoyed something is what I'm really looking forward to. It's just that engagement again, and being able to go home saying however many people who were in that theatre that night had a really great night in the theatre.
Great, thank you so much, all of you. James?
Yes, thanks everyone. That was brilliant, really great, useful insights into what it's like sitting where you're sitting in the industry. Thank you so much for all those insights and for those really useful pieces of advice for people sitting in other places in the industry. All these dialogues and conversations as we're apart, I think, are reminders of how much we miss being together, and echoing all of those. I think we're all looking forward to being in the same room with all of you and with all of you joining us today. Please do join us for our next online discussion, which is on Monday, the 3rd of August from 5 till 7. The lovely Felix Cross will be chairing a wonderful panel talking about some issues, picking up on some of the topics we discussed today, about next steps for further diversifying the musical theatre industry as a whole, and talking about career pathways and all sorts of areas there. So please do join us for what I'm sure will be a really interesting conversation then. So finally, thank you so much to all of our wonderful panelists for joining us. It's brilliant.